Chapter 1. Introduction. The Fascination of the Wild West. The Wild West still exerts a tremendous fascination today. When we think of this era, images of endless prairies, thundering herds of bison, dusty saloons, and lonely cowboys in the sunset immediately come to mind. It is a world full of adventures and dangers, full of longing for freedom and self-determination, but also a time of violence, deprivation, and tragic fates. Between the early 19th century and the end of the 19th century, an era emerged in North America that was more than just history. It became a myth that still shapes the cultural memory of the USA today and has long since had a worldwide impact. The attraction of the West lay in the promise of limitless possibilities. For many immigrants from Europe, it was the Great Hope, where land seemed freely available, where one could build a new existence with one's own hands. Entire families dared to set off, left their homeland, relying on covered wagons, horses, and the belief that a better life was waiting beyond the horizon. But what appears to be a journey to happiness in romantic tales was in reality often an arduous path full of deprivation, illness, and danger. The settlers fought against the forces of nature, against hunger and thirst, and not infrequently against the hostility of those who did not want to give up their land voluntarily. It is precisely this contrast between dream and reality that makes the Wild West so exciting to this day. It was a land of opportunity, but also a country of conflict. While some hoped to find freedom in the vastness of the continent, others saw it as the loss of their homeland. The indigenous peoples of North America experienced the expansion of the settlers as a catastrophe that destroyed their way of life and destroyed their livelihoods. Wars, expulsions, and broken treaties are just as much a part of the image of the West as the stories of brave pioneers and courageous gunslingers. In addition, the Wild West began to become a myth in its own time. Newspapers reported in dramatic terms about battles and robberies. Cheap dime novels turned simple soldiers into heroes. And showmen like Buffalo Bill brought spectacular Wild West shows to Europe. Figures like Billy the Kid, Jesse James, or Calamity Jane were real people, but their biographies were soon overgrown with legends until it was almost impossible to distinguish where the truth ends and the invention begins. This interplay of reality and narrative gave rise to a cultural image that had a stronger effect than any sober historiography. The fascination of the West is fed not least by universal themes. Freedom, adventure, justice, and survival are motifs that appeal to every person, regardless of time and origin. The West stands for crossing borders, for exploring the unknown, for the eternal striving to achieve more than one has had so far. He embodies the promise that everyone can take their future into their own hands, if they only find the courage to do so. At the same time, he reminds us of the cost of this dream, the blood that was spilled, the cultures that were destroyed, and the harshness of a life that had more to do with survival than romance in dusty streets and windswept plains. When we talk about the Wild West today, we always mean both: a historical epic that took shape between settler trains, Indian wars, the gold rush, and railway construction, and a myth that lives on in films, novels, and stories to this day. Hardly any other chapter of American history is so charged with images and cliches that fascinate and distort at the same time. In this mixture lies the real power of the West, which has become a kind of modern founding legend. In this script, we want to embark on a journey into the time when reality and legend were so inextricably linked. We will see how the idea of a divine destiny, the manifest destiny, gave rise to the urge to colonize the continent from coast to coast. We accompany the motorcades of the pioneers, the herds of cowboys, and the feverish gold prospectors in dusty mining camps. We experience the fierce battles between natives and settlers, the heroic stories of sheriffs and marshals, the desperate attempts of outlaws to escape the hard life. We look at the technical revolutions, the railroad and the telegraph that changed the West forever. And we ask ourselves how all this became the myth that is still so alive today that we relive it again and again in Hollywood films, comics, and games. It is a story full of triumphs and tragedies, full of amazement and shock. It shows us the West as a mirror of human longings and weaknesses, as a stage for great adventures and bitter defeats. It teaches us that freedom always has its price, that progress demands sacrifices, and that stories that once filled only newspapers can become entire legends that last for centuries. In the next chapter, we turn to the origin of this desire for conquest, the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that America's destiny is to dominate the entire continent. Because without this belief, the West as we know it might never have existed. Chapter 2. The Conquest of the West, Manifest Destiny, and the Dream of Boundless Freedom. The Wild West is hard to understand without the idea of the so-called manifest destiny. This term, coined in the mid-19th century, describes the belief that America's divine destiny is to rule the entire continent from ocean to ocean. For the people of that time, it was far more than a political theory. It was a vision that was deeply rooted in their thinking. It combined religious beliefs, national ambitions, and the drive for expansion into a powerful myth that determined the course of history. Even in the early years of the United States, the country was driven by an almost limitless longing for the West. Again and again, people moved over the mountains, looking for new land, settling in the wide plains. Independence from Great Britain had laid the foundation stone, but now it was a matter of creating an empire that would leave its mark on the entire continent. The West was not only a geographical space, but also a projection screen for hopes and dreams. With the purchase of Louisiana in 1803, when the U.S. acquired vast territories from France, expansion began on a large scale. The continent opened up, and suddenly it seemed as if a whole world was waiting to be conquered. Expeditions such as those of Lewis and Clark made the unknown visible. Maps were drawn, rivers and mountains were described. But with each of these explorations, the urge to appropriate this land also grew. It was a mixture of a thirst for adventure, economic interest, and a deeply rooted belief that God himself had imposed this mission on America. The phrase manifest destiny first appeared in 1845 in an article by journalist John L. O'Sullivan. It was clear to him that the United States was destined by a divine hand to expand. This conviction quickly became popular because it combined what many already felt, the pride of being part of a young, up-and-coming nation, and the conviction that one had a special task to fulfill in the world. The West became a symbol of progress, civilization, and the realization of a national mission. But while for many settlers and politicians the conquest of the West seemed like a kind of divine duty, for others it meant the exact opposite: destruction, expulsion, and loss. The indigenous peoples of North America paid the highest price for this expansion. Their territories became smaller step by step, their way of life destroyed, their rights ignored. Treaties were broken, reserves were established, wars were fought. What meant freedom for some was the end of a centuries-old culture for others. Manifest destiny also served as a justification for the war against Mexico, which was fought in the 1840s. Through him, the United States acquired vast territories in the Southwest: Texas, California, New Mexico, and Arizona. With each new stretch of land that was added, the feeling grew that the dream of sea to sea could actually become reality. But at the same time, the conflicts within the country intensified. Slavery or freedom, industry or agriculture, North or South. The contradictions of American society were also reflected in the question of how the new country was to be shaped. Despite all the tensions, the drive to the West remained unbroken. Newspapers reported on fertile soils, gold discoveries, limitless possibilities. Men and women packed their few belongings on wagons, harnessed oxen to them, and set off on the long journey. Whole columns of cars moved across the plains, fighting their way through rivers, mountains, and deserts. They followed paths that soon got names: Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, California Trail. Every step west was a step into the unknown, a step into a future that was a promise for some and a threat for others. The idea of manifest destiny acted as an invisible engine behind all of this. It gave action a higher meaning. Those who moved to the West did so not only out of necessity or hope of wealth, but also in the awareness that they were part of a great mission. Even technical development has been embedded in this myth. Railways, telegraph lines, new settlements, everything was seen as a sign of progress and the fulfillment of destiny. But this belief was not free of contradictions, for while they saw themselves as bearers of freedom and democracy, others were denied this freedom. Entire peoples lost their land, their culture, and often their lives. The dark side of manifest destiny is the story of wars, massacres, and broken promises. And yet, the dream of an America that stretches across the entire continent remained unshakable. By the end of the 19th century, this dream had almost completely become reality. The United States stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The West was drawn on maps, cities had been built, railways crisscrossed the country. But the memory of that time, when all this was still the future, remained alive. It became a tale of courage, adventure, and divine mission, and still forms the core of the myth of the Wild West today. In the next chapter, we follow in the footsteps of those who made this dream a reality, the pioneers who entered the West with their motorcades and laid the foundation for everything that came after. Chapter 3: The Pioneers, Wagon Columns, Settlers, and Life on the Trail. If you want to understand the Wild West, you have to imagine the life of the pioneers, those men, women, and children who set out into the unknown wilderness with nothing more than a covered wagon, a few oxen, and their courage. They were the ones who not only dreamed of the West, but actually entered it, step by step, mile by mile, under the scorching sun, in the freezing cold, over mountain passes and through endless plains. For many of them, it was the dawn of a better future, but for almost all of them, it also became a test that changed their lives forever. The great treks that crossed the West in the 1840s and 1850s followed routes that soon became legends: the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and later the California Trail. Thousands of wagons, pulled by oxen or mules, pushed their way across the prairie in long columns. Anyone who saw such a train could hardly believe that these people were not part of an army, but simple settlers who had set out in search of new land, freedom, or happiness. They had left their homeland, often forever, and trusted that fertile soils, milder winters, or even the gold of California were waiting for them at the end of the journey. But the reality was harsh. Even the preparations for such a trip could bring families to the brink of despair. Everything you owned had to fit in the car: tools, clothes, food, sometimes a piano or a memento of the old homeland. Every centimeter was used, and yet much had to be left behind. On the trip, it quickly became apparent that even what you had taken with you was often too much. Along the wayside were boxes, furniture, sometimes even entire wagons, which the pioneers left behind in distress because the animals were exhausted or the path became too steep. Life on the trail was a constant battle against deprivation. The days began at dawn when the animals were harnessed and the wagons were set in motion. Hours of walking, dust, heat, and endless monotony shaped everyday life. In the evening, a camp was set up. The wagons were set up in a circle, not only for practical reasons, but also to provide protection against possible attacks. The fire was lit, a meager meal was cooked, and when the stars sparkled over the wide prairie, people sang songs, told stories, or prayed for a better day. But as idyllic as some stories may sound, the journey was dangerous. Diseases such as cholera and typhoid fever killed entire families long before they reached their destination. Rivers had to be crossed, cars capsized, people drowned. Snow and cold lurked in the mountains, heat and drought in the plains. Many pioneers never reached the West. Their graves lined the routes, silent witnesses of a dream that ended too soon for them. Encounters with indigenous peoples also shaped the lives of the pioneers. They were not always hostile clashes as they were later told in many legends. Often it was a matter of trade, mutual aid, or at least cautious distance. But the more settlers came, the greater the tensions became. For the pioneers, the land was an auspicious emptiness. For the natives, it had been home for centuries. This contradiction gave rise to conflicts that soon shook entire regions. Despite all the dangers, there were also moments of happiness and hope. When the mountains finally appeared on the horizon after weeks, when rivers that offered fresh water, or when children could run around in the great outdoors, many felt confirmed in their courage. Some found a freedom in the vastness of the country that they had never known before. For women, the journey was often a double burden because they not only had to endure the exertions of the march, but also cook, wash, take care of children, and in an emergency, even drive cars themselves. Nevertheless, it was they who left the most vivid descriptions in the diaries of that time, reports full of lamentations but also full of hope. At the end of the journey, however, the longed-for paradise did not automatically await. Anyone who arrived in Oregon, California, or Kansas literally had to create a new life from scratch. Forests were cleared, fields plowed, huts built. The loneliness could be overwhelming. Neighbors were often miles away, help in emergencies unreachable. But many persevered, and it was precisely their perseverance that made the West what it became, a country conquered through work and perseverance. The pioneers of the West were not heroes in the classical sense, but people who were ahead of their time. They had the courage to set out into an uncertain future, and in doing so, they laid the foundation for the settlement of an entire continent. Their stories were often glorified later, but something else resonates in their diaries and letters: the fear of the unknown, the burden of responsibility, and the hope that all the efforts would one day be rewarded. So the Wild West does not begin with duels in dusty streets or the sound of railway wheels, but with the quiet steps of those who walked barefoot across the prairie while their wagons creaked into the sunset. Her traces disappeared in the dust, but the memory of her courage remained. In the next chapter, we'll turn to the Cowboys, those iconic figures of the West who went from being a humble drover to becoming legends of American culture. Chapter 4: Cowboys and the Cattle Herds. Myths and harsh reality. When people talk about the Wild West today, the image of the cowboy almost inevitably comes to mind. With a wide hat, spurs on his boots, a revolver on his belt, and a lasso in his hand, he rides across endless plains, drives huge herds of cattle in front of him, and sits around the campfire in the evening while the wind blows over the prairie. Hardly any other figure shapes the myth of the West as strongly as he does. But behind this romantic idea lies hard and often monotonous work that had little to do with transfiguration in novels or films. The cowboy was not a hero from a story, but a worker of the West, who sat in the saddle day after day and brought the cattle from one pasture to another. The origins of cowboyism lie in Mexico. There, the vaqueros developed techniques as early as the 16th century, which were later adopted in the USA. Riding with saddle and stirrups, handling the lasso, marking and holding herds together. When Texas was absorbed into the United States, traditions mixed, and the vaqueros became cowboys. Many terms that seem to be taken for granted today, rodeo, lasso, ranch, originate from this time and remind us that the cowboy was actually a figure on the border of two cultures. After the Civil War, cowboy life reached its peak. In Texas, millions of cattle lived freely on the plains. They had multiplied because hardly anyone had had time to cultivate them during the war. Now, however, there was an enormous demand for meat in the north of the USA, in the growing cities. The only problem was that the railroads did not yet reach Texas. So the cattle had to be driven north on foot, often over 1,000 kilometers, to the railroad junctions in Kansas or Missouri. These cattle drives were the heart of cowboy work. For weeks, the men rode, day after day, in rain, heat, or storm. They slept in the open air, cooked simple meals of beans, bacon, and coffee, and lived close together, almost like a small army. Each cowboy had a task. Some rode at the sides, others held the rear guard, and still others watched at night so that the animals did not run apart. The panic of the herd was particularly feared when the cattle were thrown into turmoil during a thunderstorm or by a sudden noise. Thousands of animals could then walk through, trample everything down, and drag people to their deaths. A single mistake could destroy the work of weeks. Despite these dangers, the life of the cowboys was less characterized by adventure than by routine. They had to mark animals, catch calves, count herds, and constantly make sure that no cattle were lost. They earned little money and worked under conditions that we would now call extremely harsh. Many cowboys were young men looking for a job. Others were former Civil War soldiers who couldn't find a place in normal life. Quite a few were African Americans or Mexicans who saw an opportunity in the cowboy profession, albeit under difficult circumstances. In this respect, the Wild West was more diverse than the later myths often portray. But precisely because everyday life was so full of deprivation, a special aura developed around the cowboy. He stood for freedom, for independence, and for dealing with nature and animals. When he sat in the saddle, he seemed to be part of the landscape, one with the endless expanse. Perhaps it was precisely this image that made him an icon, the human being asserting his place in the midst of an untamed nature. As the railroad advanced further and further south, the large cattle drives gradually became superfluous. Instead of days of marching, the cattle could now be loaded and transported directly. But by then, the cowboy had long since found his place in the collective memory. Rodeos reminded us of his abilities, Wild West shows made him a figure of entertainment, and literature did the rest to elevate him to the rank of legend. In Europe, the West was soon imagined almost exclusively as the world of cowboys, although their profession had only a short heyday. The legends about cowboys are therefore always double-edged. On the one hand, they are heroes, brave, freedom-loving, unattached. On the other hand, they were workers in a hard business that rarely brought them wealth or fame. Most cowboys led a short, deprivation life and disappeared into anonymity again. Only a few names remained in the memory, and even these were often more invented than handed down. Nevertheless, the cowboy remains the face of the West. It is the symbol of how much work and myth, reality and dream can merge into each other. The dust of his herds has long since blown away. The trails have become roads, but his image lives on, in the cinema, in novels, and in our idea of the Wild West. In the next chapter, we'll turn to another engine of expansion that was far more powerful than any herd for many people, the gold rush. Because if there was something that shaped the West as much as cattle drives, it was the feverish search for wealth in the mines of California and Nevada. Chapter 5: Gold and Silver Rush, from California to Nevada. Hardly any other event has shaped the history of the West as much as the gold rush. It began in 1848 when a worker named James W. Marshall found some shiny pieces of metal on the construction site of a sawmill on the American River in California. Soon, the rumors spread that it was gold, and within a few months, a remote valley became the center of worldwide attention. Newspapers reported enthusiastically, rumors ran rampant, and suddenly a movement was set in motion that caused hundreds of thousands of people to move west. In 1849, the first big waves of fortune seekers flocked to California, which is why they were called the 49ers. They came from all parts of the United States, many even from Europe, Latin America, or Asia. San Francisco, until then a sleepy port town, exploded into a booming city within a few months. A handful of houses became a metropolis where traders, adventurers, soldiers of fortune, and fraudsters alike tried their luck. The dream of quick wealth was the great engine of this movement. Men and women sold their homes, left families behind, or gave up secure professions to pan gold from rivers with shovels and pans. For most of them, it remained a dream, because only a few actually found riches. The work was hard, the conditions catastrophic, diseases were rampant, and often the journey alone cost more than could ever be recovered. Nevertheless, many held on to the hope that the next find would change lives forever. But gold was not only a matter of individual hope, but also a political and economic factor. With the gold rush, California began to grow rapidly, which eventually led to it being admitted to the Union as a state in 1850. Traders and entrepreneurs earned the most. They sold tools, clothing, food, and accommodation at horrendous prices. While a simple worker might find a few dollars a day, traders like Levi Strauss, who sold sturdy pants for the miners, made a fortune. This created an economy that lived not only on gold, but on the entire infrastructure around the rush. The search for precious metals did not end with California either. In the decades that followed, new deposits were discovered: silver in Nevada, gold in Colorado and Montana, copper in Arizona. The Comstock lode in Nevada became particularly famous, a huge silver vein that allowed entire cities to grow out of the ground from 1859 onwards. Places like Virginia City emerged overnight and were left to decay again a few years later. The rhythm of boom and bust shaped the West. First came euphoria, then wealth, finally decline. The mining towns reflected the whole diversity and also the whole harshness of the West. People of different backgrounds lived there next door to each other. The first improvised theaters were built there. The salons were humming and gambling flourished. At the same time, violence, prostitution, and corruption were the order of the day. In some cities, more people died from clashes in the saloon than in the mines. Law enforcement officers were rarely, and when they were often involved in shady business themselves. The environment also suffered from the gold and silver rush. Rivers were diverted, forests were cut down, entire landscapes destroyed. Indigenous peoples lost not only their land but also their livelihoods. Many tribes living in the affected regions were displaced or even wiped out. Thus, the gold rush shows a double side. It symbolizes the hope of advancement and prosperity, but at the same time also the destruction of nature and culture. Despite all the harshness, the myth of the gold rush remained alive. Because it was the great story of the dishwasher who could become a millionaire overnight. Even if only a few actually experienced this happiness, the mere possibility was enough to set people in motion. Stories of spectacular finds, of nuggets as big as fists, or of mines that made entire families rich kept the fascination going. In the end, the gold rush was an engine that changed the West like no other. It brought people together from all over the world, it accelerated the development of cities and infrastructure, and it was instrumental in the expansion of the United States to the Pacific. He created legends and destroyed livelihoods. He was a dream and a nightmare at the same time. When California is spoken of today as a land of opportunity, there is still an echo of the gold rush. It was the moment when the West became a promise, not only for Americans themselves, but for people around the world. In the next chapter, we turn to the forces that permanently changed the West far beyond gold and silver, the railroads and telegraphs, those 19th century technical wonders that connected the continent and laid the foundations of the modern United States. Chapter 6. Railways and Telegraphs: How Technology Changed the West. The Wild West is often portrayed as a world full of horses, covered wagons, and endless horseback riding. But the real power that permanently changed this region did not come from the saddles of cowboys or the shovels of gold diggers, but from the technical achievements of the 19th century, the railway and the telegraph. They marked the beginning of a new era that not only opened up the West, but also brought it into the heart of the United States. It was clear to people early on that the vastness of the continent would only be truly usable if there was a fast and safe way to transport people and goods. Covered wagons were slow, arduous, and dangerous. Those who made the journey from the East Coast to California had to plan weeks or even months. The railway promised to shorten this time to a few days. It was more than a means of transport. It was a symbol of progress, of the victory of technology over nature, and of the inexorable advance of civilization. The construction of the first transcontinental railroad was a gigantic undertaking. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln gave the go-ahead, and within a few years, dusty landscapes were transformed into the scenes of an engineering marvel. The Union Pacific built from the east, the Central Pacific from the west. Thousands of workers, including many Irish immigrants and Chinese contract workers, toiled under extreme conditions. They blasted their way through mountains, laid tracks across prairies, built bridges and tunnels. Every kilometer was a fight against the forces of nature, disease, and exhaustion. On May 10, 1869, the time had finally come. In Promontory Summit, Utah, the two lines met. The union was sealed with a symbolic golden nail. From that day on, you could travel from New York to San Francisco without leaving the train. The world had become smaller, and the West was suddenly moving closer to the East than had ever been possible before. The consequences for the West were enormous. Settlers could now get to the new areas much faster, and goods also found their way in both directions. Cities that had previously been difficult to reach suddenly grew rapidly because they were now on the rail network. Places that remained off the tracks, on the other hand, often became deserted. Entire regions lived or died depending on the course of the tracks. The railroad determined where people settled, where markets emerged, and where prosperity flowed. The railway was also a blessing for livestock farming. The large herds no longer had to be driven north on foot for weeks, but could be loaded directly. For farmers, the opportunity opened up to sell their crops quickly and in large quantities. As a result, the West was not only more densely populated, but also more closely integrated into the economy of the United States. Parallel to the railway, a second technical network was created that changed the West: the telegraph. With it, it was possible to send messages over thousands of kilometers in seconds. Where letters used to travel for weeks, a short radio message could now be enough to conclude deals or spread information. The telegraph created a new form of proximity, a kind of invisible connection that connected people and markets. This was a profound turning point for the population of the West. Suddenly, people were no longer cut off from the events on the East Coast or in Europe. Newspapers could report faster, companies could act faster, and even in the most remote places, you could feel the pulse of a nation that was moving ever closer together. But as is so often the case in the West, this development brought not only blessings, but also downsides. The railway led to the systematic shooting down of the buffalo herds, on which many indigenous peoples lived. On the one hand, to keep the animals away from the tracks, and on the other hand, to meet the demand for meat and furs. Millions of bison disappeared in a few decades, and with them, the livelihoods of entire tribes disappeared. The land that was opened up by the railway was also taken from the indigenous peoples. With every new station, every new settlement, they were pushed further back. The railway was therefore a double symbol. It stood for progress and prosperity, but also for destruction and displacement. For some, it meant the fulfillment of the American dream. For others, the downfall of their culture. Despite this ambivalence, the fascination remains. The idea of riding a train through the endless prairie, past mountains, rivers, and cities is still an image that feeds the myth of the West. The railway connected not only coasts, but people, dreams, and stories. In the next chapter, we turn to the conflicts that became inevitable as a result of the expansion, the Indian Wars, which determined the fate of the West for many years and became a bloody chapter in American history. Chapter 7: Indian Wars I: Rise and Fall of the Plains Tribes. The history of the Wild West is inconceivable without the conflicts with the indigenous peoples. Long before settlers, cowboys, and railroads shaped the country, numerous tribes lived on the plains, in the mountains, and in the forests of North America, whose cultures had developed over centuries. Especially the tribes of the Great Plains, Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, Arapaho, and many others, embodied for many the typical idea of the Indian as it was later carried on in books and films. But these peoples, who once roamed the plains proudly and freely, faced an overpowering opponent in the 19th century: the steady advance of the United States and the unstoppable stream of settlers. For the Plains tribes, life was closely linked to nature. The bison herds were their livelihood. They provided food, clothing, tools, and even building materials for the teepees. Life was focused on hunting, and with the horse, which had been used more and more since the 18th century, this life gained a dynamic marked by freedom and independence. The warriors of the tribes were considered excellent horsemen, their culture rich and full of traditions. In this world, there seemed to be little room for what the settlers brought with them: agriculture, cities, roads, and fences. As the United States began to systematically expand westward, conflict was inevitable. Initially, the government tried to create a kind of order through treaties. The tribes were promised certain territories and recognition of their rights, but these agreements were repeatedly broken as soon as new land was needed or valuable resources were discovered. The tribes had to watch as their hunting grounds became smaller, as herds of buffalo were decimated, and as foreign settlements invaded their lands. The resistance was not long in coming. Especially in the 1850s and 1860s, there were fierce disputes. Warriors attacked convoys of wagons, settlements, and railway lines to defend their land. The American army responded with violence, sending troops into the prairie and building forts that served as bases. The Indian Wars began, a long and bloody chapter that would last for decades. An early example of this escalation was the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. There, hundreds of Cheyenne and Arapaho, including many women and children, were brutally slaughtered by militias under the command of Colonel John Chivington. The event shocked even contemporaries and showed how mercilessly this conflict was fought. For the tribes, it was a signal that their survival was at stake. They formed alliances, intensified their attacks, and tried to withstand pressure from the United States. At the same time, the landscape changed irrevocably. With the construction of the railway, the paths of the buffalo herds were cut through, and targeted hunts, often only for sports or to supply the railway workers, drastically reduced the population. millions of animals were slaughtered, often just for the tongues or skins while the carcasses rotted. This was a catastrophe for the tribes. Without the bison, they would not only lose their food, but also the heart of their culture. The army deliberately exploited this situation. By exterminating the buffaloes, the tribes were deprived of their livelihood and forced into dependence on the reservations. Resistance was met with military severity, and even when individual tribes won victories, as later at Little Bighorn, this did not change the overwhelming force that stood against them. But during this time, legends were also created that shape the myth of the West to this day. Names like Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, or Quanah Parker stand for the struggle for freedom and self-determination. These chiefs were charismatic leaders who sought to hold their peoples together in a time of decline. They showed courage, foresight, and tenacity, even if they could not withstand the superior force in the end. The Indian Wars on the Plains were therefore more than just military conflicts. They were an expression of a deeper conflict between two worlds that seemed incompatible. On the one hand, the nomadic way of life, which adapted to the rhythm of nature, and on the other, the idea of ownership, progress, and expansion, which left no room for this culture. By the end of the 19th century, the resistance of the tribes had largely been broken. Many lived on reservations, dependent on the government's scant aid. But their legacy remained, not only in the memories of their descendants, but also in the stories that made the West what it is today, a stage of tragedies and heroic deeds, of loss and pride. In the next chapter, we turn to the later years of these struggles, where great battles like Little Bighorn and tragic events like the Wounded Knee Massacre sealed the end of the resistance and changed the West for good. Chapter 8: Indian Wars 2, Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, and the End of the Resistance. The second half of the 19th century brought the Indian Wars their most dramatic and, at the same time, most tragic moments. While in the early years there was still hope that individual tribes could assert their land through clever alliances or military strength, it now became increasingly clear that the expansion of the United States could not be stopped. Nevertheless, some of the most famous chapters of the resistance emerged during this time, which have been indelibly etched in the memory of the West. One of these chapters is the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. To this day, it is considered the most famous victory of the indigenous peoples over the American army. The background was the increasing settlement of the Sioux and Cheyenne area, triggered by the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. Although this land had been awarded to the Sioux by treaty, gold prospectors and settlers ignored the agreements. The government did little to prevent this, and soon it escalated. Numerous warriors gathered under the leaders Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse to defend their land. When General George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry Regiment came across this large camp, he thought he was dealing with a small group. He underestimated the strength of the opponents and divided his troops in order to encircle them. But what followed was a disaster. Several thousand warriors attacked Custer's men, surrounded them, and destroyed almost the entire unit. Custer himself fell in the battle that would soon become legendary as Custer's last stand. For the Sioux and Cheyenne, it was a triumph, a sign of resistance was not hopeless. For the United States, it was a shock that only strengthened the will to finally submit. However, the victory on the Little Bighorn could not stop the course of history. Just a few years later, the large tribes were worn down, their supplies exhausted, their way of life destroyed by the destruction of the bison herds. Sitting Bull fled to Canada with his followers, but had to return and eventually surrendered. Crazy Horse was captured and died in 1877 under circumstances that remain unclear to this day. The resistance collapsed, and the remaining tribes were forced into reservations, where hunger, disease, and lack of prospects determined everyday life. The last great, and at the same time most tragic chapter of this era took place in 1890 at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. There, a religious movement, the so-called Ghost Dance movement, had spread among the Lakota. She promised that the spirits of the ancestors would return, and the whites would disappear when the sacred dances were performed. For many desperate people who had lost everything, this was a last spark of hope. However, the U.S. government considered the movement a threat and sent troops. On December 29, disaster struck. The 7th Cavalry surrounded a Lakota camp at Wounded Knee Creek. What began as a disarmament operation ended in a massacre. When a shot was fired, it is still unclear by whom, the soldiers opened fire. Women, men, and children were mowed down. More than 250 people died. For many historians, this massacre marks the end of the armed resistance of indigenous peoples in the United States. It was a moment that finally led the Wild West into a new phase. The border was closed, the expansion completed, the natives banished to reservations. Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee are symbolic of the tragedy of this time. One is a place for the courage and determination to stand up to superior power. The other for the brutal end of a culture that no longer found a place in 19th century America. The drama of the Indian Wars spans between these two poles, from glorious victories to cruel defeats, from hope to utter despair. But the memory of these events lives on. It not only shapes the history of the USA, but also the self-image of the descendants of the indigenous peoples, who are still fighting for their rights and recognition today. In the legends and songs of the tribes, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and many others have found their immortality. They stand for pride and resilience, even if the price of their struggle was immeasurable. With the end of the Indian Wars, the West changed for good. The frontier, the border between wilderness and civilization that had defined the image of the country for so long, now seemed to have disappeared for good. They were replaced by settlements, railways, cities, and fields. But the myths that grew out of this time were to live on for a long time. In the next chapter, we turn to those men who were supposed to ensure law and order in this harsh world, or at least tried to do so, the sheriffs, marshals, and law enforcement officers of the Wild West. Chapter 9: Law and Order, Sheriffs, Marshals, and the Law of the Strongest. The Wild West was a land of contrasts. On the one hand, the hope of freedom, prosperity, and a new life. On the other hand, the constant threat of violence, insecurity, and lawlessness. Where settlements arose overnight, where gold and silver built entire cities from the ground up and left them to decay again, order was a rare commodity. In a world where state structures often did not yet exist or were far away, survival depended on a few men who had the courage or sense of duty to maintain law and order. It was the sheriffs, marshals, and deputies who became symbolic figures of a time when the law was usually in the hands of the one who drew the faster revolver. The sheriff was the central authority in many Western cities. He was usually elected and had the task of ensuring security, collecting taxes, or monitoring prisoners. But reality was far less orderly than it seemed on paper. Often, the sheriff stood alone against a multitude of outlaws, bandits, or drunken gunslingers. When there were shootings in the saloons or cattle thieves made entire herds disappear, it was the sheriff who had to intervene, sometimes supported by a few deputies, sometimes completely on his own. In addition to the sheriffs, there were the U.S. Marshals, who acted at the federal level and were primarily responsible for larger regions. They pursued offenders across state lines, escorted prisoners, and ensured that federal laws were enforced even in the most remote corners. Many famous names are associated with this office. Men like Wyatt Earp, who later became a legend of Tombstone, or Bass Reeves, an African-American marshal who arrested hundreds of criminals and yet was long forgotten. The lives of these law enforcement officers were dangerous and often marked by ambivalence. Some sheriffs were considered incorruptible, others were bought or were involved in shady dealings themselves. In an environment where gold dust, whiskey, and revolvers dominated everyday life, the line between right and wrong was blurred. There were lawmen who were hailed as heroes and those who were despised by their own communities. In many cities, the law was little more than an illusion. In the boomtowns, which were created by gold or silver discoveries, the population exploded within a few months. Thousands of men poured into the mines, saloons, gambling halls, and brothels sprang up like mushrooms, and violence followed on the heels. Those who gambled drunk and lost often drew a revolver. Disputes over land, water, or property ended in shootings on the street. Sheriffs and marshals could hardly be everywhere at once, and so the West's reputation as a place where the law of the strongest prevailed. But it was precisely in this chaos that legends arose that still have an impact today. The classic showdown, two men facing each other, hands close to the Colt, the wind blowing dust across the street, such scenes were later recreated in countless films, but they are based on real events. Although the famous duels were rare, they did exist. in Dodge City, in Deadwood, or in Tombstone, where the skirmish at the OK Corral between the Earps and the Clantons became a symbol of the entire era. For ordinary people, sheriffs and marshals were more than just civil servants. They embodied the hope that in a world full of uncertainty, there was something like justice after all. Even if they often failed, even if they were sometimes part of the problem themselves, they nevertheless offered a foothold in a society that was still forming. Violence in the West was not only a matter of bandits or soldiers of fortune, but also of deeper conflicts. Disputes over land and water rights, tensions between cattle breeders and farmers, disputes between ethnic groups, all this led to bloody feuds. In such moments, it became clear how limited the power of law enforcement really was. They were often forced to compromise or simply accept that the law could not be enforced. Despite all its shortcomings, the image of the sheriff remained a formative image of the West. He was the lone fighter who stood up to a hostile world. Even if it could not create absolute order, it symbolized the pursuit of civilization in the midst of chaos. This image was carried on in stories and later in films until it finally became an integral part of the myth of the Wild West. In the end, the order in the West was never as clear as the legends would have us believe. It was fragile, often bought, sometimes more appearance than reality. But it was precisely this uncertainty, this constant vacillation between anarchy and law, that made that epic so appealing. The sheriff with the star on his chest therefore remains one of the most famous figures in the West to this day, not because he always won, but because he tried to enforce the law in a world full of chaos. In the next chapter, we'll turn to the men who represented the other face of the game, the outlaws, bandits, and outlaws whose names remain legends to this day, and who shaped the West as much as the men with the star. Chapter 10: Outlaws and Legends, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Other Outlaws. As much as the Wild West was shaped by sheriffs, marshals, and men with the star, it also lived from those who rebelled against precisely this order, the outlaws. They were bandits, cattle thieves, bank robbers, or gunslingers, men who did not follow the rules and who nevertheless, or precisely because of this, became legends. Some of them were merciless criminals, others were revered by parts of the population as a kind of Robin Hood. What they have in common is that their names still resonate today and have long since become part of the great myth of the West. One of the most famous among them is without a doubt Billy the Kid. Probably born Henry McCarty in 1859, he grew up in poor circumstances and found his way into lawlessness at an early age. As a teenager, he was involved in shootings and thefts, and later fought in the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, a bloody conflict between rival ranchers and merchants. Billy the Kid was considered charismatic, quick with a revolver, and reportedly barely older than 20 when he committed his crimes. He has been credited with numerous murders, but many of his stories are difficult to verify. What is certain is that he was caught and shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. His early death, youthful appearance, and reputation as an untamed gunslinger made him a legend, a figure that is still romanticized to this day, though in reality, he was a hunted outlaw. Another name that is inextricably linked to the Wild West is Jesse James. Together with his brother Frank, he led a gang after the Civil War that robbed banks, stagecoaches, and trains. For many people in the South who suffered from poverty and deprivation after the war, Jesse James was more than just a robber. He appeared to them as an avenger, as someone who challenged the North and the rich. Newspapers did much to consolidate this reputation. Stories of daring robberies, daredevilism, and unwavering courage made Jesse James a kind of folk hero. But behind this image, there was also brutal violence. His raids cost the lives of many people, and in the end, it was not the state, but one of his own people, Robert Ford, who shot him in ambush in 1882. In addition to these two, many other names stand for the dark side of the West. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, who committed notorious robberies with their Wild Bunch. John Wesley Hardin, who claims to have shot over 40 people, or Sam Bass, who became famous for his train robberies. Each of these men was accompanied by the media of their time, and their deeds quickly morphed into stories that went far beyond reality. The image of the outlaw has always been ambivalent. On the one hand, there were criminals who murdered, robbed, and spread fear. On the other hand, for many, they embodied the dream of independence, living outside of rules and authority. In a world where many people felt abandoned by the state and the economy, outlaws had a certain appeal. They broke the laws that others felt were unjust, and they lived a life that was unattainable yet fascinating for most. The hunt for these men was as much a part of the myth as their deeds. Sheriffs, marshals, and bounty hunters set out to hunt them down. Sometimes it succeeded after long pursuits. Sometimes it ended in bloody shootouts. Often it was betrayal and ambush that brought down the outlaws, less often the open showdown as Hollywood later liked to stage it. The fact that the outlaws are still remembered today is less due to the reality of their crimes than to the stories that were made of them. Newspapers, dime novels, and later films formed images of rebels who were sometimes portrayed as ruthless killers, sometimes as tragic heroes. Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Butch Cassidy, they have all long been more myth than human, characters that we imagine as we would like them to be. At their core, however, these stories reflect something essential: the eternal conflict between order and chaos, between law and freedom, between the attempt to build a society and the longing to escape this society. The Wild West was the ideal breeding ground for such figures because it was full of contradictions, a land of opportunity, but also a land of hardship that made some outlaws. So what remains of the outlaws of the West is not only the memory of their deeds, but above all the realization of how much they shaped the image of this era. Without them, the myth of the West would be incomplete. They were the dark side of freedom that forced others to order, and they made the West a stage where good and evil, right and wrong, law and lawlessness were in constant tension. In the next chapter, we turn to the cities that emerged in the midst of this chaos, places that grew from dusty camps to booming settlements in a matter of months, and where all the facets of the West were concentrated. Chapter 11: Cities in the Wild West, from mining camps to boomtowns. The Wild West is often associated with endless expanses, prairies, and lonely cowboys, but the cities that sprang up in the middle of this wilderness were just as formative. Many began as small collections of tents or wooden huts, erected by soldiers of fortune who set up camp near gold or silver finds. These places, initially nothing more than makeshift mining camps, were able to grow into real boomtowns within a few months. The rhythm of these cities was restless, their growth explosive, and just as quickly as they emerged, many disappeared again when the veins of gold dried up or the hopes were dashed. Anyone who entered such a camp found a world full of contrasts. On the one hand, hard work in the mines or on the ranches. On the other hand, a vibrant nightlife in saloons, arcades, and brothels. The streets were often nothing more than dusty or muddy paths, lined with wooden shacks offering goods of all kinds. Merchants sold tools, food, and clothing at horrendous prices, while soldiers of fortune tried to increase their gold in the game. The saloon was the heart of every boomtown. Here people drank, celebrated, argued, and shot. It was a meeting place, a place of jurisdiction, a post office, and sometimes even a church all in one. The atmosphere of these places was electrifying and dangerous at the same time. Everyone wanted to get rich quickly, and where great hopes meet, disappointments and conflicts are not far away. Disputes over property rights often led to shootings, and lawlessness was omnipresent. Sheriffs and marshals tried to bring order to this chaos, but they were often outnumbered and outgunned. Some cities were therefore considered strongholds of violence, places where it was better not to travel alone after dark. An example of such a city is Deadwood in South Dakota. It was created in the 1870s during the gold rush in the Black Hills and quickly became a magnet for adventurers, soldiers of fortune, and notorious figures. Names like Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane are inextricably linked with Deadwood. Hickok, one of the most famous gunslingers of his time, met his end here, shot while playing cards with a hand that later became legendary as Dead Man's Hand. Deadwood is a symbol of those cities that quickly became symbols of the Wild West. But not all cities disappeared after a short time. Some grew into permanent centers, especially if they were located on railway lines or gained additional importance through agriculture and livestock breeding. Cities such as Denver, San Francisco, or later Dallas developed from small settlements into metropolises that gained importance far beyond their beginnings. For many people, they were the destination of the long journey to the West, places where they found work, community, and a bit of security. These cities reflected the diversity of the West. People from all walks of life lived here. Eastern Americans, European immigrants, Chinese, Mexicans, African Americans, and of course, members of indigenous peoples who were often on the margins of society. The mixture was explosive and often led to tension, but it also turned cities into melting pots in which new cultures emerged. The architecture of these places was mostly simple, improvised, and due to rapid growth. Wooden walls, corrugated iron roofs, tents, and simple wooden houses determined the picture. But as soon as wealth flowed, more magnificent buildings were built. Brick houses, hotels, theaters, and banks. A boomtown could go from a miserable collection of boards to a city of streetlights and newspapers within a few years, and just as quickly fall into disrepair when the foundation was lost. What united all these cities was the irrepressible urge for life, for movement, for opportunities. They were places of hope and despair at the same time. For many people, they meant their first contact with the West, their first experience of its harsh reality. Here, it was decided whether someone could gain a foothold or perish. The cities of the West were thus more than just backdrops for shootings and falloons. They were the heart of a society in upheaval, a mirror of the dreams and abysses of that time. Some survived and flourished, others disappeared without a trace, but each one wrote a piece of the great chapter, Wild West. In the next chapter, we look at an often underestimated side of the West, the women, who played just as important a role in this harsh world as the men, and whose stories have been in the shadows for far too long. Chapter 12. Women in the West: Pioneers, Settlers, and Gunslingers. When we think of the Wild West, men usually appear in our mind's eye: cowboys, sheriffs, gunslingers, or outlaws. But this era would not be conceivable without the women who helped shape it. They accompanied the trucks west, they started families in the wilderness, they ran businesses in the boomtowns, and fought for survival with the same severity as the men. Many of them remained nameless, their stories disappeared in diaries or letters, but they were the backbone of everyday life in the West. It was the pioneer women who moved in the motorcades with their families, while taking responsibility for children, meals, and order. They often had to drive cars on the side when the men were sick or dead. In the diaries of that time, there are descriptions that tell of courage, deprivation, and unwavering perseverance. Diseases, hunger, the birth of children under the most adverse circumstances. All this was part of their everyday life. Without their commitment, life in a foreign country would hardly have been possible. In the settlements, too, women had a decisive influence on the West. They ran inns, bakeries, laundries, or small shops. Some became entrepreneurs who built wealth with skill and foresight. In a world where men were often driven by adventure, it was often women who provided consistency, who laid the foundation for communities. Their work was less spectacular, but indispensable for survival. At the same time, many women had to cope with the harshness of the conditions. Widows were not uncommon, and some were forced to eke out a living on their own. Some found their way into professions that were frowned upon in society at the time, such as saloon girls or prostitutes. They too were part of the image of the West, no matter how much it was later romanticized or concealed. For many, this was the only way to gain a foothold in a man's world, in which work and property were almost exclusively male-dominated. But there were also women who slipped into the roles of fighters and gunslingers. Names like Calamity Jane or Annie Oakley are still known today. Calamity Jane, whose real name was Martha Jane Canary, led a life full of adventures, was a scout, nurse, sometimes a prostitute, and always a dazzling figure. She was considered hard-drinking, trigger-happy, and fearless, a woman who did not fit into the role that society had intended for her. Annie Oakley, on the other hand, became famous for her shooting skills. In Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, she impressed viewers in America and Europe with her marksmanship, breaking the image of women as mere accessories. In addition to these well-known figures, there were countless women who left their mark without ever becoming famous. Farmers who tilled the land while their husbands were far away. Teachers who taught children to read and write in small schools. Nurses who saved lives under the most adverse conditions. Their stories are less spectacular, but they tell of the strength that was needed to shape the West in the first place. Not to be forgotten is the role of indigenous women. They were bearers of traditions, collectors, craftswomen, and often mediators between cultures. Many suffered particularly from the consequences of expansion. Expulsion, violence, and forced assimilation destroyed their lives. Nevertheless, many held on to language, rituals, and identity even under the most difficult conditions. Women in the West were not marginal figures, but co-creators of an era. They had to fight for their place and often lived under conditions that hardly anyone would have endured. But they contributed to the fact that tents became cities, that order arose from chaos, and that life in the West was more than a constant struggle. Their legacy is quieter than that of the gunslingers, but it is deeply rooted. Without them, the West would not have become what it was, a home for millions of people, a place where dreams were lived but also sacrificed. In the next chapter, we turn our attention to the military side of this great upheaval, to the role of the U.S. Army, which shaped the face of the West with its forts, soldiers, and campaigns, and at the same time represented a controversial power. Chapter 13: The Role of the U.S. Army, Forts, Soldiers' Life, and Indian Policy. The Wild West was not only the stage of cowboys, settlers, and outlaws, but also a military space. Wherever new settlements were formed or railroads were built, the U.S. Army was not far away. Their task was to secure expansion, protect trade routes, and bring the indigenous population under control. Without their presence, the West might never have been opened up so quickly, but at the same time, their work is still marked by violence, oppression, and broken promises. The forts that the Army built in the West were the backbone of this strategy. They were often located at river crossings, near settlements, or along important trails. Some were small collections of log cabins surrounded by palisades. Others grew into larger garrisons with barracks, stables, magazines, and parade grounds. Fort Laramie, Fort Kearny, or Fort Apache became well-known names that stood not only for military power, but also for encounters, negotiations, and conflicts. For settlers, these forts were a symbol of security, a place to seek shelter. For the indigenous peoples, on the other hand, they were memorials to foreign rule, outposts of a power that claimed their land. The lives of the soldiers in these forts were far less heroic than the legends suggest. Many recruits came from poor backgrounds or had fought in the Civil War and found no other place in society. They served for low pay, suffered from hard discipline, poor care, and often boredom. Everyday life consisted of guard duty, patrols, exercises, and the maintenance of the fort. Direct fighting rarely occurred, and when it did, it was often short and brutal. Diseases claimed far more victims than battles, and isolation in remote regions made life even more difficult. The Army also played a decisive role in the so-called Indian policy. Treaties concluded with the tribes had to be enforced, by force if necessary. If tribes refused to move to reservations, they were forced to do so by military means. Entire campaigns, such as those against the Sioux, the Cheyenne, or the Apaches, determined the image of the West for decades. The superiority of the Army was overwhelming. Modern weapons, supply routes, and a steadily growing number of soldiers met peoples whose livelihoods had already been destroyed by the destruction of the bison herds. The battles against the Apaches in the Southwest became particularly well known. Led by figures such as Cochise and Geronimo, they put up fierce resistance for decades. The soldiers had to cross vast deserts, endure heat and lack of water, and face an opponent who knew the terrain better and used guerrilla tactics. The fight against Geronimo became almost an obsession until he finally surrendered in 1886. His capitulation ended one of the last major uprisings in the West. But the Army was not only a party to the war. It also acted as a mediator, as a protecting power for settlers and traders, a guardian of trade routes. In the forts, negotiations with tribal leaders took place, trade relations were established, and relief supplies were distributed. Many soldiers experienced the indigenous peoples not only as enemies, but also as neighbors with whom they shared respect and sometimes even friendship. An often overlooked aspect is the so-called Buffalo Soldiers, African-American soldiers who served in special regiments after the Civil War. They fought against the indigenous peoples in many campaigns, built roads and telegraph lines, and kept watch in remote forts. For them, serving in the army meant a rare opportunity for income and recognition, but at the same time, they were prejudiced and had to fight twice as hard for respect. Their contribution to the West is still a piece of history that has long been overshadowed. The U.S. Army in the West was therefore much more than just an instrument of violence. It was an institution that helped to integrate the West into the nation, but also violently changed it. It brought security and destruction at the same time. It built bridges and roads, but also graves. In the end, there is a contradictory picture. For some, the army was the guarantor of progress and civilization. For others, it was the tool of a war of annihilation against their culture. But it is precisely this ambivalence that reveals the truth of the West. It has never been just a place of freedom, but always a theater of power. In the next chapter, we will turn to the cultural facets of this habitat, the music, religion, and everyday habits that shaped the West and gave it a face that reached beyond struggles and conflicts. Chapter 14: Culture in the West: Music, Religion, and Everyday Life. When we look at the Wild West, the first thing we often think of is fights, duels, or major upheavals. But behind these dramatic moments was an everyday life that was characterized by simple routines, music, faith, and community. The West was not only a stage for heroes and outlaws, but also a habitat in which people tried to create normality. It is precisely these inconspicuous aspects that tell us a lot about how it was possible for tents to develop into cities and societies from provisional ones. Music played an amazingly important role in the West. It was comfort, entertainment, and an expression of identity. At the Cowboys' campfire, songs were played that dealt with hard life, longing, and homesickness. Often, they were simple melodies that were accompanied on harmonica, violin, or banjo. Many of these songs originated in Europe, but were adapted in the West and developed into their own repertoire, which later formed the basis of American folk and country music. Music was also part of everyday life in the cities. In saloons, people played the piano, sometimes accompanied by a singer who drowned out the noise with her voice. Dance evenings offered the opportunity to escape the hard life and brought people of different backgrounds together. Religion was another important part of Western life. The churches were often the first permanent buildings in new settlements. Itinerant preachers moved from place to place, held services in the open air, and brought people a piece of familiarity in the midst of the wilderness. For many settlers, faith was a source of hope and support, especially in the face of deprivation and danger. At the same time, religion also brought new conflicts. Missionaries tried to convert indigenous peoples and thus contributed to the destruction of their cultural independence. Everyday life in the West was characterized by work, improvisation, and community. On the farms, the day began at dawn. Men tilled the fields, women took care of the house and children, and often both sexes had to take on all the tasks when there was a need. Children helped from an early age. They drove cattle, collected wood, or took care of smaller animals. Free time was scarce, and if it was available, it was usually spent with neighbors or in social gatherings. In the cities, life was more varied, but no less hard. In addition to work in mines or craft workshops, there were markets, theaters, and newspapers that spread news. Libraries, schools, and associations came into being as soon as a community stabilized. The West was therefore also a place of education, although this often took place under the most difficult conditions. Teachers taught in small wooden huts, sometimes with only a few books, but always with the will to give the children a better future. The food also tells a story of the West. In the motorcades and ranches, people lived on beans, bacon, corn flour, and coffee. Fresh vegetables or fruit were rare, meat often only available in the form of dried, cured meat. In the cities, the offer was larger but expensive. Restaurants offered simple dishes, while saloons served drinks such as whiskey, beer, or sarsaparilla. Many immigrants brought their own culinary traditions with them, and so a mixture was created that reflected the diversity of the population. Despite the hardships of life, a distinct culture of celebration developed. Holidays such as Independence Day or Thanksgiving were celebrated with large festivals. Rodeos, horse races, and shooting competitions offered the opportunity to show strength and skill. Such festivals were not only entertainment, but also important for the cohesion of the community. They brought together people who often lived far away from each other in everyday life. Last but not least, the written word also played a role. Newspapers were founded in almost every major settlement, sometimes by a single printer working with a small press. They covered not only local events, but national politics and stories from around the world. Dime novels, cheap dime magazines, spread legends about gunslingers and Indian fights and shaped the image of the West even at a time when it had not even been completely conquered. The cultural everyday life of the West was thus more than just a sideshow. He was the foundation that held society together while the great upheavals raged outside. Music, religion, work, and community made people feel that they were not just survivors, but creators of a new world. In the next chapter, we turn to the political framework in which all of this took place, the decisions, conflicts, and power struggles that shaped the West not only at the local, but also at the national level. Chapter 15: The Wild West in Politics, Expansion, Presidents, and Conflicts. The Wild West was not only a landscape full of adventure and myths, but also a political project. Behind every trek, every railroad line, and every newly built fort were decisions made in Washington. Presidents, senators, and governors played as important a role in the history of the West as cowboys or outlaws. For the expansion to the West was not only the work of individual pioneers, but the result of a political vision that became known as Manifest Destiny and that shaped the entire nation. It was clear early on that the United States would not remain on the coast after its independence. With the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, France acquired a huge area that opened the way to the West. Later, Texas, California, and large parts of the Southwest were added by the war against Mexico. Each of these steps was politically controversial, but they all contributed to making the dream of an ocean-to-ocean nation a reality. Presidents such as Thomas Jefferson, James Polk, and later Ulysses S. Grant were architects of this expansion, even if the consequences for indigenous peoples and neighboring states were catastrophic. The question of how to use the new land led to fierce conflicts within the United States. Should slaves be allowed to be kept there or not? This debate divided the nation and was a central factor that eventually led to the Civil War. The West was not only a geographical target, but also a political battlefield on which the great contradictions of the young republic became apparent. After the Civil War, the West again served as an outlet for the enormous upheavals. Former soldiers sought a new life there, and the government used the expansion to consolidate the unity of the country. Another political aspect was Indian policy. Treaties were made and broken. Reservations were established and moved again when gold or silver was discovered. The government in Washington vacillated between trying to assimilate indigenous peoples and the brutal reality of military subjugation. Laws such as the Dawes Act of 1887 aimed to destroy tribal cultures by dividing up the land of communities and assigning it to individuals. Behind the language of civilization and integration was a politics that wiped out entire cultures. The railway was also a political project. Without state subsidies and land allocations, the large companies would never have been able to lay their rails over thousands of kilometers. The government generously distributed land rights to the railroad companies, which in turn attracted settlers. Entire cities were thus created out of political calculation, and the course for the development of entire regions was often set in congressional debates. Presidents also used the West to underpin their political agenda. Theodore Roosevelt, for example, who already belonged to the era after the classic Wild West, saw the vast landscapes as a symbol of the nation's strength and character. He promoted national parks and conservation, a late response to the destruction caused by the expansion. But the policy of the West was not only a national strategy, it was also felt locally. Governors and local politicians had to master the balancing act between settlers, railroad companies, cattle barons, and mine owners. Corruption was widespread, and it was not uncommon for money and influence to decide how laws were applied. Whoever determined land rights, water access, or transport routes had power, and this power was often used ruthlessly. At the same time, the West became a symbol in political rhetoric. He stood for freedom, independence, and the American dream. Politicians used this image to win voters and invoke national unity. The fact that the reality often consisted of violence, exploitation, and deprivation hardly played a role. The myth of the West was already a political tool at that time. In the end, the West was not an accidental product, but the result of a consistent policy. It was planned, promoted, fought for, and suffered. For some, it meant advancement and progress. For others, oppression and loss. But in any case, it was a mirror of the political forces that shaped the United States in the 19th century. In the next chapter, we turn to a particularly exciting part of this development, the cattle barons, the ranches, and the so-called range wars, in which nothing less than the most valuable commodity of the West, land and water, was at stake. Chapter 16: Cattle Barons, Ranches, and Range Wars, Battles for Land and Water. The Wild West was not only a land of adventure, but also a land of economic interests. In addition to gold and silver, it was above all cattle that promised prosperity and influence. Herds of cattle grazing on endless pastures became the symbol of the West. Whoever controlled them, who had the land and the water, determined power and wealth. Out of this situation grew the so-called cattle barons, men who ran huge ranches and whose influence extended far beyond their own lands. But where wealth and power arise, conflicts are not far away. And so the range wars, the battles for grazing rights and water, became a bloody chapter in the history of the West. The ranches that sprang up in the 19th century were often huge farms. Entire herds of thousands of cattle were kept on open pastures that seemed limitless. Cattle barons such as Charles Goodnight or John Chisholm in Texas and New Mexico became legendary figures who shaped entire regions. Their ranches were economic centers that provided work for cowboys, blacksmiths, cooks, and merchants. At the same time, they were politically influential because they had land, money, and contacts. But the dream of infinite expanse had its limits. As more and more settlers moved west, they began to claim land, plant fields, and erect fences. What had previously been open prairie suddenly became private property. For the ranchers, this was a threat. Their herds needed space, and the freedom of movement they had been used to for years was restricted. The conflicts became particularly fierce when barbed wire was invented. It allowed settlers and farmers to effectively demarcate their land, and open grazing began to falter. The range wars usually ignited at water sources and grazing rights. In a dry country, water was the most precious commodity. Whoever controlled a river or a spring could determine who survived and who failed. Ranchers, farmers, and sometimes entire communities got into arguments about it. There were cattle thefts, arson, and robberies. Armed men were often hired to defend the interests of the respective side. It was not uncommon for these clashes to end in shootings that terrified entire regions. One of the most famous range wars was the Lincoln County War in New Mexico in the 1870s. Rival groups of ranchers and traders fought for trade supremacy and control of the land. Billy the Kid also appeared in this conflict, taking sides and thus starting his notorious career. The Lincoln County War exemplifies how economic interests, personal feuds, and lawlessness intertwined. Another notorious conflict was the Johnson County War in Wyoming in the early 1890s. Here, powerful cattle barons and smaller farmers faced each other. The cattle barons accused the farmers of cattle theft and sent armed troops to secure their power. Fighting ensued that became so threatening that the U.S. Army eventually had to intervene to stop the bloodshed. This war made it clear how great the tensions were between wealth and poverty, between tradition and change in the West. The range wars were not only battles for land, but also for a way of life. The cattle barons defended a system based on open pastures and large herds, while the farmers enforced a new order based on agriculture, fences, and individual property. In the end, the farmers prevailed. The West was fenced in, open grazing disappeared, and with it the era of large cattle drives. But the legend of the ranches and the cattle barons remained. They embodied the power of the West, the combination of nature, work, and wealth. To this day, the image of the ranch stands for freedom and self-determination, even if in reality it was often characterized by hard work, conflict, and injustice. The range wars show that the West was never just a romantic place full of adventure, but also a space of hard-hitting economic interests. Behind the image of cowboys and open plains were battles for resources that were fought as fiercely as any battle of the Indian Wars. In the next chapter, we look further south, to the border with Mexico, where cultures met, new conflicts, new myths, and a very special dynamic arose, which also decisively shaped the West. Chapter 17. The Border to the South, Texas, Mexico, and the Border Conflicts. The history of the Wild West is inextricably linked to the border with Mexico. In Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, cultures, languages, and traditions met, often peacefully, often in bloody conflicts. This border region was a melting pot where Spanish, Mexican, and American heritage mixed, and it became one of the most troubled and at the same time fascinating locations in the West. Texas played a special role in this. Originally part of Mexico, more and more immigrants from the United States settled there from the 1820s onwards in search of fertile land. Soon tensions arose, as the settlers had different ideas of law, property, and way of life than the Mexican government. The friction eventually led to the Texas Revolution, which culminated in famous episodes such as the Battle of the Alamo. In 1836, Texas declared its independence, and less than 10 years later, it was admitted to the United States, a move that triggered the war between the USA and Mexico. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 was a pivotal moment in the history of the West. The United States conquered vast territories: California, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Utah, and Nevada, which henceforth became part of the Union. For Mexico, this meant the loss of almost half of its territory. For the United States, the final access to the Pacific and the basis of its expansion. But with the new territories came the challenge that people were already living there: Mexicans, indigenous peoples, and mixed populations who were now suddenly under American rule. After that, the border remained a zone of uncertainty. Cattle thefts, robberies, and smaller wars shaped everyday life. Gangs moved across the border, and both Mexican and American troops tried to establish order. The indigenous peoples also played a major role. Apaches and Comanches waged their own wars and made the border region a permanent conflict zone. With the expansion, the importance of the borderlands for the myth of the West also grew. It was here that figures such as the Texas Rangers emerged, a paramilitary unit that was initially created to protect settlers from raids and soon became a legend. They fought against bandits, Indian tribes, and later also in the conflicts with Mexico. Their reputation was ambivalent. For many Americans, they were heroes, but for Mexicans and indigenous groups, they were often brutal oppressors. The border was also a cultural space. Spanish architecture, Catholic churches, Mexican music and cuisine mixed with the influences of the American settlers. In cities like San Antonio or Santa Fe, a unique mixture was created that can still be felt today. At the same time, there were tensions because the Mexican population was often disadvantaged and had to fight for their rights. The dynamics of the border continued in the late 19th century. With the railroad and growing trade, cities along the border became important hubs. But violence remained a constant companion. Revolts in Mexico, smuggling, and border raids caused unrest, and the U.S. Army repeatedly intervened to secure its interests. The indigenous peoples also played a major role. Apaches and Comanches waged their own wars and made the border region a permanent conflict zone. With the expansion, the importance of the borderlands for the myth of the West also grew. It was here that figures such as the Texas Rangers emerged, a paramilitary unit that was initially created to protect settlers from raids and soon became a legend. They fought against bandits, Indian tribes, and later also in the conflicts with Mexico. Their reputation was ambivalent. For many Americans, they were heroes, but for Mexicans and indigenous groups, they were often brutal oppressors. The border was also a cultural space. Spanish architecture, Catholic churches, Mexican music and cuisine mixed with the influences of the American settlers. In cities like San Antonio or Santa Fe, a unique mixture was created that can still be felt today. At the same time, there were tensions because the Mexican population was often disadvantaged and had to fight for their rights. The dynamics of the border continued in the late 19th century. With the railroad and growing trade, cities along the border became important hubs. But violence remained a constant companion. Revolts in Mexico, smuggling, and border raids caused unrest, and the U.S. Army repeatedly intervened to secure its interests. For the myth of the West, the border was a particularly fertile ground. Stories of bandits, heroic rangers, and fierce battles fueled people's imaginations. Figures such as Pancho Villa in the early 20th century, although already after the classical epic of the West, tie in directly with this tradition. Rebels, outlaws, and freedom fighters who carried on the image of an untamed border. The border between the USA and Mexico was thus never just a line on the map. It was a space of encounter and debate, a place where cultures collided and new identities emerged. It reflected the toughness, but also the diversity of the West. In the next chapter, we turn to another driving force of the frontier, the settlers, who transformed the prairies into fertile land with agriculture permanently changing the landscape of the West. Chapter 18: Settlers and Agriculture, from Prairie to Farmland. In addition to cowboys, gold prospectors, and outlaws, it was above all the simple settlers who permanently shaped the face of the West. They did not come with the goal of seeking adventure or quick riches, but to own a piece of land, build a farm, and secure a future for their family. For many, the dream of owning their own land was the driving force that led them to leave their homeland in the East, or even in Europe, and set off for the unknown expanses of the prairie. A pivotal moment was in 1862, when the Homestead Act was passed. This law promised each settler 160 acres of land, about 65 hectares, if he was willing to cultivate it and stay there. For many people, this was a unique opportunity to become independent. Hundreds of thousands of people set off, loaded their cars, and searched Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, or Oklahoma for a place where they could settle down. But the reality was far harsher than the promises suggested. The prairie was not a friendly country. Endless plains, extreme temperatures, storms, and droughts made life difficult. In the first few years, many families lived in so-called sod houses, small huts made of grass sod because wood was scarce. The isolation was just as much a challenge as the physical work. Fields had to be cultivated with primitive tools, wells dug, and houses built, often all at the same time. Illnesses and accidents took a heavy toll, and it was not uncommon for settlers to give up and move on. Nevertheless, many managed to put down roots. Over time, villages, schools, and churches were built. The railway brought markets closer so that grain, corn, or cattle could be sold. New agricultural techniques, such as the use of steel plows or, later, mowers, made work easier and increased yields. Thus, the prairie was transformed piece by piece into fertile farmland that fed the growing population of the United States. The settlers were not alone. Many of them were immigrants from Germany, Scandinavia, Ireland, or Eastern Europe. They brought their traditions, languages, and ways of life with them, and so diverse communities emerged on the levels. Church bells rang in German, Norwegian festivals were celebrated, and at the same time, people adapted to the new world. This mixture of cultures shaped the West just as much as the wide fields and the farmhouses. But here, too, conflicts were not far away. The land promised to the settlers had often been inhabited by indigenous peoples before. For them, the expansion of the farms meant the loss of their livelihoods. Fences cut off hunting grounds, fields displaced buffalo, and reserves were established to make room for the new farmers. Behind the dream of farmland, there was always the reality of repression and injustice. For the farmers themselves, life remained full of uncertainties. Drought years, plagues of locusts, or falling prices could destroy livelihoods. Many got into debt, and it was not uncommon for families to have to leave their country again. But those who persevered were able to achieve a certain stability. The farmhouse, the well, the barn, they became symbols of success, visible signs that the West had been conquered and taken possession of. Agriculture in the West was thus more than just food production. It was a political and cultural project. It transformed the prairie into an orderly space. It created families, schools, and communities, and it laid the foundation for America as we know it today. In the next chapter, we will focus on those people who have perhaps shaped the image of the West the most, the Cowboys, their work, their culture, and the myths that surround them. Chapter 19: Cowboys and Their Culture. Work, myth, and reality. If there's one character who embodies the Wild West like no other, it's the cowboy. With Stetson, boots, and lasso, he became an icon that still shapes the image of the West today. But there is a world of difference between the myth of the lonely hero riding across the prairie and the reality of the hard, everyday life of a cattle herder. The story of the Cowboys is a story of work, deprivation, freedom, and legend at the same time. The real task of a cowboy was simple. He had to herd, drive, and care for herds of cattle. After the Civil War, livestock farming boomed because the demand for meat in the cities of the East grew enormously. Millions of cattle grazed on the plains of Texas, New Mexico, or Kansas, and they had to be driven long distances to the railroad stations, from where they were transported onward. These cattle drives were the big stage of the Cowboys. For weeks, they rode through prairies, rivers, and forests, day and night at the side of the herds. They had to endure storms, cross raging rivers, fend off robbers, and catch escaped cattle again and again. Everyday life consisted of endless hours in the saddle, often in bad weather, with little sleep and meager food. Beans, bacon, and coffee were standard. There was no luxury. They spent the nights around the campfire. Their blanket was the starry sky. Despite the hardship, a culture of its own developed. Cowboys had their language, their clothes, and their music. Songs around the campfire helped to calm the herds and alleviate their own loneliness. The lasso was her most important tool, boots and spurs her equipment, and the hat protected her from the sun and rain. Much of this was later romanticized, but it was initially simply a practical necessity. The Cowboys were by no means a homogeneous group. Many came from poor backgrounds, others were former soldiers. A significant proportion were African Americans who found work in the West after the Civil War. Mexicans, the vaqueros, also had a decisive influence on the culture of the Cowboys. Many techniques of riding, lasso throwing, and cattle driving come directly from them. The cowboy is therefore a child of different cultures, a symbol that grew out of diversity. But how did he become a legend? A large part of this was due to the so-called dime novels, cheap dime magazines that were read en masse in the East. They turned cowboys into romantic heroes who fought bandits, defeated Indians, or survived in dramatic adventures. In reality, life was often monotonous, exhausting, and dangerous, but hardly as spectacular as the stories would have you believe. The cattle drives themselves were also only an episode. With the advent of the railway and barbed wire, open pasture farming was increasingly displaced. Ranches took over the supply, and the big tracts gradually disappeared. Nevertheless, the image of the cowboy lived on, not least because of Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, which thrilled audiences in the USA and Europe at the end of the 19th century. Here, the cowboy finally became an icon, the symbol of the free man who was one with his horse and ruled over the wilderness. To this day, the figure of the cowboy fascinates. It stands for freedom, independence, and a connection to nature, which seems lost in an industrialized world. At the same time, it is a symbol of hard work, courage, and determination. The myth may be exaggerated, but it is rooted in a reality that was characterized by perseverance and the will to survive. The cowboy is therefore more than just a character from the past. It is a part of cultural memory, an image that has burned itself deeply into the idea of the West. Between harsh reality and romantic exaggeration, a legend arose that still resonates today. In the next and final chapter, we turn to the legacy of the Wild West, how it was remembered, how it became a legend, and how it continues to shape the idea of America today. Chapter 20: Legacy and Myth: The Wild West in Memory and Legend. The end of the 19th century also closed the chapter of the classic Wild West. According to many historians, the border, the so-called frontier, had been crossed, the country had been opened up, and the major conflicts had been decided. But this was the beginning of a new story, the history of memory. The West, which had previously been a place full of harsh reality, now became a legend, a myth that has remained alive to this day. Even then, the transfiguration began. Newspapers, dime novels, and Wild West shows turned cowboys, sheriffs, and outlaws into heroic figures. Buffalo Bill Cody was one of the first to understand how the West could be marketed. With his Wild West show, he toured the United States and even Europe. In elaborately staged demonstrations, he presented fights with Indians, buffalo hunts, cowboys, and shooting skills, a spectacle that thrilled millions of spectators. It was a mixture of truth and fantasy, and that was precisely where its effect lay. The West became a symbol of freedom, adventure, and the American dream. At a time when the United States was becoming more and more industrialized, the myth of the West offered a contrast. While factories, cities, and railways changed the country, the idea of endless plains, lonely horsemen, and unlimited possibilities remained a place of longing. The West became a projection screen for ideals that increasingly disappeared in the modern world. The West also found its place in literature. Writers such as Owen Wister with The Virginian, or later Zane Grey, created novels that consolidated the image of the honorable cowboy who fought for law and order. These stories contributed decisively to the fact that the memory of the West remained shaped not by harsh realities, but by romantic ideas. In the 20th century, cinema took on the role of continuing to tell the story of the West. Western movies became one of the most popular genres ever. John Wayne, Gary Cooper, and Clint Eastwood embodied characters who had long been greater than life. Whether in black and white or in the epic expanses of CinemaScope productions, the West was suddenly more alive on the screen than it had ever been in reality. Here, the image of the showdown on the dusty road, of the heroic sheriff, or of the lonely outlaw finally became an icon. But over time, the view also changed. Later films and books began to shed more light on the dark sides. The violence against indigenous peoples, the destruction of nature and cultures, the harshness of everyday life, all of this slowly found its way into the narratives. The myth remained, but it became more complex. The West was understood not only as a heroic story, but also as a tragedy. To this day, the Wild West is an integral part of American identity. Rodeos, Western festivals, national parks, and tourist attractions keep the memory alive. Cities like Tombstone or Deadwood live on their reputation for having been the setting for legendary stories. At the same time, the cowboy is still a symbol of freedom, independence, and a life in harmony with nature. But the West is not only American cultural heritage. It has long since become part of a global imagination. From Karl May in Germany to Western movies in Italy to pop culture in Asia, the Wild West has become a universal myth. Everyone knows him, even if the reality was often different. So the legacy of the West lies in this mixture of truth and legend. It was a place full of conflict, deprivation, and injustice, but also full of hope, adventure, and new opportunities. It was an epoch in which cultures collided, in which people sought their fortune and failed or triumphed. Today, the West lives on, especially in our imagination. In songs, stories, films, and pictures that say more about our longings than about historical reality. But that's exactly where its power lies. The Wild West is not just history. It is a myth that fascinates us to this day because it embodies the tension between freedom and order, between dream and reality in a unique way. This is how the journey through the Wild West ends, not with a pistol shot, but with the realization that this part of the story is never really finished. It lives on in memories, in legends, and in the idea of a place where everything was possible. The West was more than a time, it became an idea, and ideas don't die.